There's a kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, but from the belief that no one could ever understand the weight you carry in silence. Damien lived with that loneliness. He wasn't isolated because he lacked people around him, but because he'd learned that proximity doesn't equal connection, that sharing space doesn't mean sharing truth. He built an empire from nothing, constructed walls of glass and steel that touched the sky, but the highest tower he ever built was the one around his heart, and no one had ever found the door until a woman with worn shoes and careful hands walked into his penthouse and saw something all the others had been too distracted to notice. If this story touches your heart, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Comment where you're listening from, and if you feel it was really worth it, consider becoming a member to get early access to upcoming stories. Your support makes all the difference. The penthouse occupied the entire 42nd floor, suspended above the city like a castle in the clouds. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around 3 sides, offering views that made visitors forget to breathe. Manhattan spread below like a glittering circuit board, alive with light and movement and the endless hum of ambition. But Damien rarely looked at the view anymore. Beauty becomes ordinary when you see it every day, when you wake to it alone and return to it alone, and sit surrounded by it in silence so heavy it feels like drowning. The space was immaculate, professionally designed with that careful balance of luxury and coldness that appears in architecture magazines. Everything was white, chrome, glass, marble. Clean lines, minimal furniture, not a single object out of place. It looked like a showroom, like no one actually lived there. And in many ways, no one did. Damien existed there, slept there, sometimes ate there. But living required something more, something he'd forgotten how to do. He was 38 years old, though people often guessed younger. Good genes, expensive skincare, a disciplined life. He was tall, just over 6 feet, with dark hair that was beginning to show silver at the temples, sharp features that photographs loved, and eyes the color of storm clouds. Women noticed him. They always noticed. At business dinners, charity galas, investor meetings, he could feel their attention like heat against his skin. Some were bold, some were subtle, but they all wanted the same thing, or thought they did. They wanted the man they saw, the version that existed in Forbes articles and Wall Street Journal profiles. The billionaire, the self-made success story, the eligible bachelor with the penthouse and the portfolio and the perfectly tailored suits. But they didn't want what came with him, the parts that didn't photograph well, the pieces he kept locked away in rooms no one was allowed to enter, not even the cleaning service, especially not the cleaning service. For 5 years, Damien had employed the same company. They sent different people sometimes, but always professionals, always discreet, always efficient. They came on Tuesdays and Fridays, early morning when he was already at the office, and when he returned, everything would be pristine, every surface gleaming, every cushion perfectly arranged, and he would feel nothing. Gratitude, maybe, in an abstract way, but nothing real, nothing warm. They were ghosts who left cleanliness in their wake, and that was exactly what he wanted, or what he thought he wanted, until the day the agency called and said they were sending someone new. Her name was Elena. The agency manager mentioned it casually, apologetically, explaining that their regular team was overwhelmed, that this was temporary, that Elena came highly recommended. Damien had barely listened. He didn't care who cleaned his apartment as long as they were thorough and invisible. He left for work at 6:30 that Tuesday morning, the same as always, and didn't think about it again until he came home 14 hours later and immediately knew something was different. The apartment was clean, perfectly clean, but there was something else. A presence. Not a physical presence, she was long gone, but an energy, a warmth, like the space had been touched by something human instead of just processed by professionals. There was a single yellow daisy in a small glass on the kitchen counter, placed beside the coffee maker. Just one flower, simple and bright and completely unauthorized. Damien stood staring at it for a long time. His first instinct was irritation. He didn't ask for flowers. He didn't want personal touches. He wanted invisible, professional, unchanged. But he didn't remove the daisy. He left it there and went to bed, and dreamed of yellow for the first time in years. Friday morning, another daisy appeared, this time beside the bathroom sink. No note, no explanation, just a small gesture that felt enormous in a space so deliberately empty. Damien called the agency. He intended to complain, to establish boundaries, to remind them that he paid for cleaning services, not decoration. But when the manager answered, something stopped him. Instead, he heard himself asking when Elena would be coming back. Tuesday and Friday mornings, the manager confirmed. Same as always, 6 to 10 a.m. Damien hung up without mentioning the flowers. The following Tuesday, Damien did something he'd never done before. He stayed home. He told his assistant to clear his morning, ignored the confused response, and at 6:15 a.m., he was sitting in his living room with a book he wasn't reading, waiting. She arrived exactly at 6:30. He heard the key in the lock, the soft sound of the door opening, careful footsteps in the entryway. Then she appeared, and Damien forgot how to breathe. She was small, maybe 5'3", with long, dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, warm brown skin, and eyes like melted chocolate. She wore simple, black pants and a white button-down shirt, the unofficial uniform of cleaning professionals. But on her, it looked different, looked elegant somehow, looked right. She carried a caddy of supplies in one hand and had a canvas bag slung over her shoulder. And when she saw him sitting there, she froze, her eyes going wide with surprise and something that might have been fear. "Oh," she said softly. "I didn't know you'd be home. I can come back later if you prefer." Her voice was gentle, musical, with the faintest accent he couldn't quite place. Something Eastern European, maybe, softened by years in America. "No," Damien said, standing quickly, then feeling foolish for standing, then feeling more foolish for feeling foolish. "No, please, continue. I decided to work from home today." It was a lie, and they both knew it. He never worked from home. The penthouse was for sleeping, for existing in the hours when the office was closed, but never for working. Work happened in the glass tower 12 blocks south, in the corner office, with the view and the reputation and the expectations. Elena studied him for a moment with those dark eyes, and Damien had the strangest sensation that she could see through him, that she knew exactly why he was there, even if he barely knew himself. "All right," she said finally, a small smile touching her lips. "I'll try not to disturb you." She moved past him toward the kitchen, and Damien caught the scent of something clean and simple, like lavender and lemon, and he wanted to follow her, wanted to ask her name even though he already knew it, wanted to ask where she was from and why she left flowers, and whether she knew what those small gestures meant to someone who'd forgotten what kindness looked like. But he didn't. He sat back down with his unread book and pretended to be absorbed while she worked, while she moved through his space with quiet efficiency, while she hummed something soft and wordless under her breath. The sound filled the apartment in a way nothing ever had, made it feel less like a museum and more like a place where someone might actually want to live. She cleaned the kitchen first, methodical and thorough, and Damien found himself watching over the top of his book, studying the way she moved, the care she took with everything she touched. She didn't just wipe surfaces. She paid attention, noticed things, adjusted a picture frame that hung slightly crooked, straightened books on a shelf he never read, moved with a kind of reverence that suggested she understood that spaces hold meaning, that how we keep our homes reflects how we keep ourselves. When she finished the kitchen, she moved to the living room, working around him with practiced ease, never intrusive, never rushed. She dusted the bookshelves, vacuumed the rug, cleaned the windows until they disappeared, and all the while Damien sat frozen, pretending to read, acutely aware of every movement, every breath, every second of her presence. Then she did something unexpected. She paused in front of his bookshelf, tilted her head slightly, and pulled out a volume. It was an old copy of Neruda's poetry, a book Damien had bought years ago in a moment of romantic optimism, had read once, had never opened again. Elena held it carefully, ran her fingers over the cover with something like affection, then looked at him. "You read Neruda," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Sometimes," Damien replied, his voice rougher than intended. "A long time ago." She smiled, warm and genuine. "Me too. My grandmother used to read his poems to me when I was small. She said they taught her how to feel big feelings in a world that wanted everything small." Damien felt something crack inside his chest, some small fissure in the wall he'd spent years constructing. "That's beautiful," he said quietly. "She is," Elena agreed, carefully replacing the book exactly where she'd found it. "Beautiful and wise." They didn't speak again that morning, but something had shifted. Some invisible line had been crossed, and when Damien returned home that evening, he found himself looking for another Daisy, found himself disappointed when there wasn't one, then feeling foolish for caring about something so small, then feeling sad that he'd become the kind of man who thought kindness was small. Friday came, and he stayed home again. His assistant didn't question it this time, just rescheduled his meetings, and probably wondered if he was dying, if this was the beginning of some breakdown, some billionaire crisis that would require intervention. But Damien wasn't dying. He was waking up. Elena arrived at 6:30, same as before, and this time, she didn't seem surprised to see him. She just smiled, that small, gentle smile that made the whole apartment feel warmer, and began her work. This time, Damien didn't pretend to read. He made coffee, poured 2 cups without asking, and when she came to clean the kitchen, he held one out to her. Elena hesitated, looked at the cup, looked at him, and something uncertain crossed her face. "I shouldn't," she said softly. "I'm working." "So am I," Damien replied, technically. "Please." She took the cup, their fingers brushing for just a second, and Damien felt that touch like electricity, like a current running through his entire body from such a small point of contact. "Thank you," Elena said, wrapping both hands around the mug as if warming them, even though the apartment was perfectly climate-controlled. They stood there in silence, drinking coffee together, and it was the most comfortable Damien had felt in years, just standing in his own kitchen with another human being, not performing, not presenting, just existing in the same space without expectations or agendas or carefully constructed versions of themselves. "How long have you been cleaning?" Damien asked finally, more because he wanted to hear her voice than because he cared about the answer. 3 years in New York, Elena said. "Before that, I did different things. Worked in a flower shop, in a small restaurant, whatever I could find when I first came here." And before New York? He knew he was prying, knew this crossed professional boundaries, but he couldn't stop himself. "Before New York was Romania," she said quietly, looking down into her coffee. "A small village in the mountains that probably doesn't exist on any map you've ever seen. I came here when I was 23. Alone, with almost no English, and big dreams about what America would be." She laughed, but it wasn't bitter, just honest. The dreams were bigger than the reality, but the reality wasn't bad. Just different. Just harder than I imagined. Why cleaning? Damien asked. If you don't mind me asking. Elena considered this, her head tilted slightly in that way she had. That way that made it seem like she was really thinking about her answer, really trying to give him truth instead of politeness. Because people's homes tell you who they are, she said finally. When you clean someone's space, you see them, the real them, not the version they show the world. You see what they care about, what they ignore, what they hide, what they've given up on. It's intimate in a way most people don't realize. She looked up at him then, directly, unflinching. Your home is very clean, Damien, very empty, very sad. The words should have felt like an attack, like an invasion, like something to be defended against. But they didn't. They felt like relief, like finally someone had noticed. Someone had seen past the marble and the chrome and the carefully maintained perfection to the loneliness underneath. You're right, Damien said, his voice barely above a whisper. It is sad. I'm sad. I just didn't realize anyone could tell. Elena set down her coffee cup, and something in her expression shifted, became gentler somehow, more open. Everyone is a little sad, she said softly. That's not unusual. That's not wrong. But most people have things around them that remind them they're alive. Photographs, clutter, mistakes, life. Your home looks like you're hiding from life instead of living it. And that, I think, is the real sadness. Damien wanted to argue, wanted to explain about minimalism, about focus, about the discipline required to maintain success at his level. But he couldn't, because she was right, because every word she spoke was truth. He'd been avoiding for years, because this small woman he'd known for exactly 10 minutes had seen through him more clearly than anyone ever had, and instead of running from that exposure, he felt grateful for it. What would you change? He asked. If you could. If this were your space, what would make it less sad? Elena smiled, and this time it reached her eyes, made them sparkle with something like mischief. I would make it messier, she said. I would put books on tables instead of just shelves. I would hang pictures that mean something instead of expensive art that means nothing. I would open the windows and let the city noise in, let the imperfection in, let the life in. She gestured around the pristine living room. This is beautiful, Damien, but beauty without warmth is just architecture. From that day forward, Damien stayed home every Tuesday and Friday morning. He stopped pretending it was about work, stopped making excuses to his assistant, just blocked off those hours as unavailable and refused to explain why. Elena never questioned it, never commented on his presence, just arrived at 6:30 and filled his apartment with her quiet presence, her gentle humming, her careful attention to detail. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. A book appeared on the coffee table, one Damien had been reading, left open to mark his place instead of properly shelved. A throw blanket draped over the back of the couch, cream-colored cashmere that Elena had found, folded in a closet and insisted, looked sad locked away. Plants started appearing, small succulents at first, then larger ferns, then a fiddle leaf fig that Elena placed near the window and promised to teach him how to keep alive. They developed a routine. Damien would make coffee. Elena would accept with less hesitation each time, and they would talk. Not about anything particularly deep at first, just small things, safe things, the weather, the news, books they'd read, places they'd been. But gradually the conversations deepened, became more honest, more vulnerable. Elena told him about her grandmother who raised her, who taught her that kindness was the only currency that mattered, who died the year before Elena left Romania, and whose absence still ached like a fresh wound. Damien told her about building his company from nothing, about the years of 100-hour weeks, and sleeping in his office, and sacrificing everything for success, about reaching the top and discovering that the view was breathtaking but the air was thin and lonely. She told him about learning English by watching old American movies, about how she still sometimes dreamed in Romanian and woke confused about where she was. He told her about his childhood in a small town in Ohio, about a father who drank and a mother who left, and a younger sister he'd tried to protect but couldn't save from her own demons. The more they talked, the more Damien realized how much of his life he'd spent not talking, not sharing, not letting anyone close enough to see the real him, the broken parts, the scared parts, the parts that didn't fit the image of the successful entrepreneur who had everything figured out. Elena listened to all of it without judgment, without trying to fix anything, just bearing witness to his story, with the same careful attention she brought to cleaning his home. And Damien began to understand what she'd meant about intimacy, about how letting someone see your space, your real space, the messy, vulnerable, authentic space, was its own kind of nakedness. He was 42 floors above the city, surrounded by every luxury money could buy, and the thing he wanted most in the world was more time with a woman who cleaned his apartment, more mornings of coffee and conversation, more moments of being seen and accepted instead of admired and desired. One Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after Elena first walked into his life, Damien woke early and did something he hadn't done in years. He went into his bedroom closet, pulled out a box from the back, and opened it. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, memories he'd packed away because looking at them hurt too much. His sister's high school graduation, his mother before she left, himself at 25, hungry and ambitious and hopeful. He pulled out a photograph of his grandmother, his father's mother, the only person who'd ever really loved him unconditionally, who'd believed in him when no one else did, who'd died when he was 30 and left him feeling more alone than he'd ever imagined possible. He stared at her face, at her smile, at the way she'd looked at the camera like she was looking at him, and he felt tears on his face for the first time in 8 years. When Elena arrived, she found him sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by photographs, tears still wet on his cheeks. She didn't say anything, didn't ask what was wrong, didn't try to comfort or fix or change anything. She just set down her cleaning supplies, sat down next to him on the floor, and waited. Damien looked at her, at this woman who'd somehow become essential to his mornings, to his breathing, to his slow remembering of what it felt like to be human. And he said, "I don't know how to do this." "How to do what?" Elena asked gently. "How to let people in," Damien said. "How to be close to someone without being terrified they'll leave. How to want something and not destroy it by wanting it too much. I've built my whole life around being self-sufficient, around not needing anyone. And now, I don't know how to need someone even though I do, even though I need you, and that terrifies me." Elena picked up one of the photographs, studied it carefully. "This is your grandmother?" she asked. Damien nodded, not trusting his voice. "She has kind eyes," Elena said, "like someone who knew how to love without conditions." "She did," Damien managed. "She was the only one who ever did." Elena set the photograph down gently and turned to face him fully. "Damien, needing someone isn't weakness. Being terrified isn't failure. You spent your whole life building walls because the people who should have protected you didn't, because the people who should have stayed left, because you learned early that love was conditional and safety was temporary. Of course you're scared. Of course you don't know how to do this. But that doesn't mean you can't learn. That doesn't mean you're broken beyond repair." "How do you know that?" Damien asked. "How do you know I'm not too damaged, too closed off, too far gone?" "Because I see you," Elena said simply. "I see you trying, I see you staying home on Tuesday and Friday mornings, even though it makes no sense for your schedule. I see you leaving books out and accepting plants and drinking coffee with someone you pay to clean your apartment. I see you crying over photographs instead of keeping them locked in a closet. You're not too far gone, Damien. You're just scared. And scared isn't the same as incapable. They sat there together on the floor, surrounded by fragments of Damien's carefully hidden past, and slowly he began to talk. He told her things he'd never told anyone, about the night his mother left, about finding his father passed out and having to get his sister to school, about working 3 jobs to pay for college while his father drank away everything they had, about the guilt he still carried for not being able to save his sister from following the same path, about the way success had felt like betrayal, like he'd abandoned her by escaping. Elena listened to all of it, never interrupting, never judging, just being present with him in his pain in a way no one ever had before. When he finally finished, when the words ran out and left him empty and exhausted, she reached over and took his hand. "Your sister's choices weren't your responsibility," she said quietly. "Your father's addiction wasn't your fault. Your mother's leaving wasn't about you. You survived, Damien. You did more than survive. You built something beautiful from all that brokenness. But you're right about one thing. You forgot to build a life along with the success. You forgot that homes need people, that hearts need connection, that nobody can heal in isolation no matter how expensive the isolation is." "What if I hurt you?" Damien asked, the question that had been living in his chest since the moment he realized he was falling for her. "What if I try to let you in, and I'm too broken, too damaged, too much? What if wanting you destroys what we have?" Elena squeezed his hand gently. "Then we'll deal with it together," she said. "That's what connection means, Damien. It's not a guarantee that nothing will go wrong. It's a promise that when things go wrong, you won't face them alone. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm not asking you to have everything figured out. I'm just asking you to try, to show up, to let me see you, really see you. Not just the successful version, but the scared version, the broken version, the version that cries over photographs and doesn't know how to need people. That's the version I want to know. That's the version I'm already falling for." Damien looked at her, at this extraordinary woman who'd walked into his life disguised as someone hired to clean his apartment, who'd seen through all his defenses and instead of running, had moved closer, had stayed, had chosen to care about him despite every reason not to. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. Elena smiled, that warm, gentle smile that had become his favorite thing in the world. "That's not for you to decide," she said. "I get to choose who deserves my time, my care, my heart. And I choose you, Damien, not because you're perfect, but because you're real. Because underneath all this," she gestured around the penthouse, "all this expensive emptiness, there's a good man who's just forgotten how to believe in his own goodness. And I want to help you remember." Something broke open in Damien's chest, some last wall crumbling, and he pulled Elena into his arms, holding her tight like she was the only thing keeping him anchored to earth. She wrapped her arms around him and held him back with surprising strength for such a small person. And they stayed like that for a long time, just breathing together, just being together, just letting the moment be exactly what it was, without trying to define it or control it or make it into something else. When they finally pulled apart, Damien kept his hands on her shoulders, needing the contact, needing the confirmation that she was real, that this was happening, that he wasn't imagining the possibility of something different, something better, something more. "Can I take you to dinner?" he asked, and immediately felt foolish because it seemed so inadequate, so ordinary, so small compared to what was happening between them. Elena laughed, and the sound was like light breaking through clouds. "Yes," she said, "but not somewhere fancy. Somewhere real. Somewhere with good food and loud conversation, and people who aren't afraid to take up space. I've seen enough careful perfection in this apartment. I want to see you somewhere messy and alive." "Deal," Damien said, and he was smiling, really smiling, and he couldn't remember the last time his face had felt this way. Couldn't remember the last time joy had felt this accessible, this possible, this real. They went to a small Italian restaurant in Brooklyn that Elena knew, the kind of place with checkered tablecloths and candles stuck in wine bottles, and a grandmother in the kitchen who came out to hug regular customers. Elena was a regular. She introduced Damien to the owner, to the waitress, to 3 other people at neighboring tables, and he watched her move through this space with such easy warmth, such natural connection, and realized how much he'd been missing, how much of life happened in these small moments of casual intimacy, of belonging without performance, of being known and welcomed just for being yourself. The food was incredible. Simple pasta and fresh bread and wine that tasted like sunshine, and they talked for hours about everything and nothing, about their childhoods and their dreams and their fears and their hopes. Damien told her about wanting to do something meaningful with his wealth, about feeling guilty for having so much when others had so little. Elena told him about wanting to go back to school, about a dream of becoming a therapist, of helping other immigrants navigate the trauma of displacement and starting over. "Why don't you?" Damien asked. "You'd be incredible at that." "Money," Elena said simply. "School is expensive, and I send most of what I make back to my family in Romania. My mother, my younger brothers, they depend on what I can send. I can't justify spending that money on myself when they need it more." Damien wanted to offer to pay for her education, wanted to solve this problem the way he solved all problems, with resources and checkbooks and the power of wealth. But something stopped him. He was learning, slowly, that Elena didn't want to be saved. She wanted to be seen. She wanted to be valued for who she was, not for what he could do for her. So instead he said, "Tell me about your dream. What kind of therapist would you want to be?" And Elena's face lit up, and she talked for 20 minutes about trauma-informed care, about the specific challenges immigrants faced, about wanting to create spaces where people felt safe enough to fall apart and put themselves back together differently. And Damien listened and watched and fell deeper in love with every word. They walked home through Brooklyn, through streets alive with music and laughter, and the beautiful chaos of people living their lives openly, unafraid, unapologetic. Elena slipped her hand into Damien's like it was the most natural thing in the world, and he held on tight, afraid to let go, afraid this was all a dream he'd wake from and find himself alone again in his empty penthouse. But it wasn't a dream. It was real, this connection, this possibility, this terrifying, wonderful feeling of being seen and chosen and cared for, not because of what he'd accomplished, but because of who he was underneath all the accomplishments. When they reached her building, a modest walk-up in a neighborhood that was slowly gentrifying but still held onto its character, Elena turned to face him. "Thank you," she said softly, "for tonight, for being brave enough to try." Damien cupped her face in his hands, these hands that had built an empire, but had forgotten how to touch gently, how to hold tenderly, how to offer comfort instead of control. "Thank you," he said, "for seeing me, for staying, for believing I'm worth the effort of getting to know. Can I kiss you?" he asked, because consent mattered, because Elena had taught him that care meant asking instead of assuming, that strength meant vulnerability instead of dominance. "Yes," she whispered. "Please." He kissed her softly, reverently. like she was something precious and fragile, even though he was learning she was actually strong and resilient and more capable than he'd ever be. She kissed him back with a gentleness that made his chest ache, and when they finally pulled apart, they were both smiling, both a little breathless, both aware that something significant had shifted between them, that they'd crossed from possibility into reality, from maybe into yes. Damien didn't want the night to end, didn't want to return to his penthouse alone, didn't want to break this spell of connection and closeness, but he also didn't want to push, didn't want to assume, didn't want to do anything that might make Elena feel pressured or uncomfortable. So he just held her hand and looked at her and tried to memorize this moment, her face in the streetlight, her smile, the way she looked at him like he was someone worth knowing instead of someone worth impressing. "I should go," he said reluctantly. "You have to work tomorrow." "Actually," Elena said with a small, mischievous smile, "tomorrow is Wednesday. I don't work at your place on Wednesdays." "Oh," Damien said, feeling foolish for not knowing her schedule, for not paying attention to anything beyond the mornings she was in his space. "Right. I knew that." "No, you didn't," Elena laughed. "You've been so focused on Tuesday and Friday, you probably don't know what day it is half the time." She was right. Time had become strange since she entered his life, divided into mornings, with Elena and everything else. The everything else barely registering as real. "But I could see you tomorrow anyway," Elena said quietly. "If you wanted. We could do something normal, like people do when they're getting to know each other. We could go to a museum or walk through Central Park or just get coffee somewhere that isn't your kitchen." "I'd like that," Damien said, probably too quickly, too eagerly. But he didn't care about playing it cool, about maintaining distance, about protecting himself from wanting too much. He wanted this. He wanted her. He wanted mornings and evenings and everything in between. He wanted normal and extraordinary, and all the beautiful ordinary moments that made up a life shared with another person. They made plans to meet at the Metropolitan Museum in front of the Impressionists because Elena loved Monet, and Damien wanted to see what she loved, wanted to understand what moved her, what made her eyes light up with that particular kind of joy. He watched her disappear into her building, waited until he saw a light come on in what he assumed was her window, then finally made himself walk away, made himself get in the car his driver had waiting 3 blocks away, made himself return to the penthouse that suddenly felt more empty than it ever had before. But it was a different kind of empty now. Before, it had been the emptiness of absence, of lack, of nothing there to begin with. Now, it was the emptiness of potential, of space waiting to be filled, of loneliness that knew what it was missing and could imagine what it might become. Damien stood in his living room, in the space Elena had slowly been transforming with plants and throw blankets and life, and he pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found his sister's number, the number he hadn't called in 3 years, the number he'd told himself was pointless to call because she never answered, because she was too far gone, because there was nothing he could do to help someone who didn't want to be helped. But Elena's words echoed in his mind. Nobody can heal in isolation. He pressed call before he could talk himself out of it. It rang 4 times, and he was about to hang up when a voice answered, rough, suspicious, but unmistakably hers. "Hello?" "Sarah," Damien said, his voice catching on her name. "It's me. It's Damien." There was a long silence. Then, "I know who you are. I still have caller ID." Another silence. "Why are you calling?" "Because I miss you," Damien said, and he was surprised to find it was true. Surprised to find that underneath all the anger and guilt and disappointment, there was still love, still connection, still the memory of a little girl he'd tried to protect, and a young woman who'd chosen a different path than he'd hoped, but was still his sister, still family, still someone worth trying for. Because I've been an asshole for 3 years. Because I gave up on you, and that wasn't fair. And I want to try again, if you'll let me. Sarah didn't speak for a long time, and Damien could hear her breathing, could imagine her standing somewhere, trying to decide if she should hang up or stay on the line, if his sudden reappearance in her life was worth the risk of hope and disappointment. "I'm 6 months sober," she said finally, her voice small. "I'm working in a coffee shop in Portland. I have a sponsor and a therapist and a studio apartment that smells like mildew, but it's mine. I'm trying, Damien. I'm really trying." Damien felt tears on his face again, twice in one day, a record for someone who'd spent 8 years not crying at all. "I'm proud of you," he said. "I'm so damn proud of you, Sarah. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry I gave up. I'm sorry I made your addiction about me, about my failure to save you, instead of about you and what you needed. I'm sorry I wasn't there. Will you let me try again? Let me be there now, even if it's late, even if I missed so much." They talked for 2 hours. Sarah told him about rehab, about the daily fight to stay clean, about rebuilding her life one small choice at a time. Damien told her about Elena, about learning to let someone in, about starting to understand that connection required vulnerability, that love required risk, that healing required community instead of isolation. When they finally hung up, Damien felt lighter than he had in years, like some weight he'd been carrying had shifted, hadn't disappeared, but had become more manageable now that it was shared. He thought about Elena, about the way she'd looked at his photographs and helped him remember that his past held more than pain, that his family held more than failure, that reaching out was always worth the risk, even when the outcome was uncertain. The next day, Damien met Elena at the Met. She was waiting exactly where she said she'd be, standing in front of Monet's water lilies, her head tilted back, her expression peaceful and absorbed. She looked beautiful in a simple green dress that made her skin glow, her hair loose around her shoulders. And when she saw him, her face lit up with such genuine happiness that Damien felt his heart physically respond, felt it beat faster, felt it remember what it was built for. They spent 4 hours wandering through galleries, Elena teaching him how to look at art, really look, not just glance and move on, but stop and notice and let beauty affect you. She showed him how different artists saw light, how they captured movement, how they made paint on canvas feel alive and breathing. Damien had been to the Met dozens of times for galas and fundraisers, had walked past these same paintings in expensive suits while networking and performing. But he'd never really seen them until Elena taught him how to look. She made everything feel new, feel possible, feel worth paying attention to. They had lunch in the museum cafe, terrible overpriced sandwiches that they laughed about, and then walked through Central Park, joining the river of humanity that flowed through that precious green space in the heart of the city. Elena told him more about Romania, about the village where she grew up, about mountains and forests, and a way of life that felt ancient and timeless. She told him about her grandmother's garden, about learning to grow things, about the satisfaction of putting seeds in earth and watching them become food, become flowers, become life. "I want to have a garden again someday," she said wistfully. "Even just a small one. Herbs on a balcony maybe, tomatoes in pots. Something that grows." Damien thought about his penthouse, about the terrace he never used, about the space that could hold a garden if someone cared enough to plant one. "I have a terrace," he said. "It's never been used for anything except looking impressive in photos. But it gets good sun. If you wanted, we could plant something there. Together." Elena stopped walking and looked at him. "Are you sure?" she asked. "That's your space, Damien. I don't want to intrude." "You're not intruding," Damien said. You're making it better. You're making everything better." She smiled that smile that made the world feel right, and they kept walking, hands linked, planning what they might grow, how they might transform that empty space into something living and green and beautiful. That evening, Damien invited Elena to his penthouse for the first time outside of her working hours. She'd only ever been there as the cleaning person, moving through the space with professional purpose, maintaining boundaries, keeping distance. But now she came as herself, as the woman he was falling in love with, and everything felt different, felt charged with possibility, and nervousness, and hope. He'd made dinner, attempted to make dinner, his first time cooking in the designer kitchen that had mostly been used for reheating takeout. Pasta, simple sauce, bread from a good bakery, wine that cost more than most people made in a week, but tasted like ordinary wine, because Damien was learning that expensive didn't always mean better, that the best things in life were usually simple and real and earned through effort instead of purchased with money. Elena walked through the apartment slowly, taking it in from a different perspective, seeing it as a guest instead of a worker. "You've made changes," she said, noticing the photographs now displayed on shelves, the books scattered on surfaces, the plants thriving in their new homes. "It looks more lived in, more like someone actually exists here instead of just occupying space." "You did that," Damien said. "You taught me how." They ate dinner on the terrace, under string lights Damien had hung that afternoon, overlooking the city that sprawled below them like a glittering promise. The food was mediocre at best, the pasta slightly overcooked, the sauce too salty. But neither of them cared, because it wasn't about the food. It was about the effort, the trying, the vulnerability of doing something imperfectly, and sharing it anyway. After dinner, they sat together on the outdoor sofa, wrapped in a blanket because October nights in New York carried the first whispers of winter, and they talked about futures, about possibilities, about what they might build together if they were brave enough to try. Damien told Elena about his conversation with his sister, about the plan to visit Portland next month, about starting to repair the relationships he'd abandoned in his pursuit of success. Elena told him about her dream of going back to school, about the specific program she wanted to attend, about the terror and excitement of imagining a different future than the one she'd resigned herself to. "I want to help," Damien said carefully. "Not because I think you need saving, or because I want you to owe me anything, but because I have resources, and you have dreams, and it seems foolish not to connect those things when I care about you and want to see you flourish." Elena was quiet for a long time, and Damien worried he'd overstepped, worried he'd made her feel obligated, or uncomfortable, or reduced her to a charity case. But when she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful instead of angry. "I want to say yes," she said slowly. "I want to accept your help because it would change my life, because I could start school next semester instead of saving for 5 more years, because it would mean I could help my family and pursue my dreams instead of choosing between them. But I also want to make sure we're doing this for the right reasons. I don't want your money to become the foundation of our relationship. I don't want to wonder if you care about me or if you just like the feeling of helping someone." Damien turned to face her fully, took both her hands in his. "I care about you," he said firmly. "I cared about you before I knew anything about your dreams, or your struggles, or your family in Romania. I cared about you when you were just the woman who left daisies in my apartment and saw through my walls. The money is just a tool, Elena. It's something I have that could make your life easier, that could help you help others eventually. But it's not why I want you. It's not what this is about." "What is this about?" Elena asked softly. "For you. What do you want from this, from us?" Damien took a breath, gathering courage, preparing to be more honest than he'd ever been with anyone. I want mornings together that aren't just Tuesday and Friday. I want to wake up next to you and make terrible coffee and burn toast and laugh about it. I want to plant a garden on my terrace and watch you teach me how to keep things alive. I want to meet your family in Romania and show you my hometown in Ohio. I want to support your dreams and have you challenge mine. I want to learn how to be in a relationship, how to be vulnerable, how to need someone and let them need me back. I want to build a life with you, Elena. Not because you clean my apartment, or because I have money, or because we're trying to fix each other, but because you see me, and I see you, and that feels like the most valuable thing I've ever found. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. I want that too, she said. All of it. And I'm terrified because I've never wanted anything this much, never let myself imagine something this good, never believed I deserved something this real. But I'm willing to try if you are. I'm willing to be scared and do it anyway. They kissed then, deeply, passionately, and it felt like a promise, like a beginning, like stepping off a cliff together and trusting they'd figure out how to fly. When they finally pulled apart, Damien stood and held out his hand. "Come with me," he said. "There's something I want to show you." He led her inside, through the living room, down the hallway she'd cleaned 100 times but never questioned, to the door at the end. The door that was always closed, the door she'd been instructed never to open. "This is what you found," Damien said quietly. "This is what made you stop and wonder about me. This is why you started leaving daisies." He opened the door and Elena stepped inside. The room was large, maybe 20 by 30 feet, with the same floor-to-ceiling windows as the rest of the penthouse. But unlike the rest of the apartment, this room was full. Full of color, full of chaos, full of life. The walls were covered in paintings, dozens of them, ranging from small canvases to massive pieces that took up entire sections. Some were finished, polished, gallery-ready. Others were half done, abandoned mid-stroke, paint dried and cracking. Still others were just beginnings, sketches and underpainting, ideas waiting to be realized. There were easels everywhere, 6 or 7 of them, each holding a different work in progress. Paint supplies covered every surface, tubes and brushes and palettes and rags, the beautiful mess of active creation. "You paint," Elena whispered, moving slowly into the room like she was entering a cathedral. "You're an artist." "Was," Damien said. "A long time ago. Before the company, before the success, before I convinced myself that art was a hobby and business was real life. I studied painting in college, got accepted to several MFA programs, had a professor who believed I could make it as a professional artist. But then my sister got sick and my father died, and I had bills to pay and responsibilities to handle. So I put it aside, took a job in finance because I was good with numbers, built the business because I was good at strategy, made millions because I was willing to work harder than everyone else. And I locked this room because it reminded me of everything I'd given up, every dream I'd sacrificed, every part of myself I'd amputated in the pursuit of success." Elena walked around the room slowly, studying each painting with the same careful attention she brought to everything. The work was extraordinary, raw and emotional, and technically brilliant, the kind of art that made you feel something even if you couldn't articulate what. There were landscapes that felt lonely, cityscapes that captured alienation, portraits that revealed their subject's hidden pain. But there were also moments of hope scattered throughout, small paintings of hands touching, of light breaking through clouds, of flowers growing in concrete, like some part of Damien had always believed in beauty, even when he couldn't let himself live in it. "Why did you stop?" Elena asked, turning to face him. After you locked the room, why didn't you come back? Because I was ashamed, Damien said simply. Ashamed that I'd given up on something I loved. Ashamed that I'd let money and success become more important than passion and creation. Ashamed that I'd become exactly what I'd promised myself I'd never be, someone who traded authenticity for achievement. Elena walked back to him, placed her hand over his heart. You haven't traded anything, she said gently. You've just been on a long detour. But detours aren't destinations, Damien. You can still come back. You can still create. You can still be an artist and a businessman, still paint and build companies, still honor all the parts of yourself instead of choosing which ones are acceptable. This room isn't a monument to failure. It's proof that the part of you that creates beauty never died. It just went quiet for a while. Damien pulled her close, overwhelmed by her understanding, by her refusal to let him diminish himself, by the way she saw potential instead of failure. I haven't painted in 8 years, he said. I don't know if I still can. There's only one way to find out, Elena said. And there was that mischievous smile again, that spark of joy that made everything feel possible. Paint something. Right now. With me watching. Show me who you were before you became who you thought you had to be. Damien hesitated. The thought of painting after so long felt terrifying, felt exposing, felt like opening a door he'd bolted shut for good reasons. But Elena was right. Detours weren't destinations. And he was learning, slowly, that the scary things were usually the things most worth doing. He walked to an empty easel, selected a clean canvas, chose paints without thinking too much, let his hands remember what his mind had tried to forget. He started painting, and it felt like breathing after holding his breath for years. Felt like coming home to a part of himself he'd disowned. Felt like permission to be complete instead of fractured. He painted Elena. Not a realistic portrait, but an impression, a feeling, the way she made him feel. He painted her in yellows and greens, warm colors, living colors, the colors of growth and hope and new beginnings. He painted her eyes, seeing and accepting. He painted her hands, gentle and capable. He painted her smile, the thing that had first cracked his carefully constructed walls. He painted for 2 hours, lost in the work, in the flow, in the pure joy of creation without agenda or audience, or need to sell, or impress, or perform. Elena sat quietly on the floor, watching, never interrupting, just bearing witness to his return to himself. When he finally stepped back from the canvas, exhausted and exhilarated, he looked at what he'd created and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Pride. Not the pride of closing a deal or seeing his net worth increase or reading praise in the business press, but the pride of making something that didn't exist before, of translating feeling into form, of honoring the part of himself that created beauty for its own sake, instead of for profit or prestige. It's beautiful, Elena said, standing to look at the painting properly. It's me, but it's also how you see me, like I'm made of light. You are, Damien said simply. At least to me you are. You brought light into spaces that had been dark so long I'd forgotten they could be anything else. Elena kissed him then, soft and slow, and whispered against his lips, "Paint more. Paint every day. Don't lock this room again. Don't lock this part of yourself away. Promise me." "I promise," Damien said, and he meant it. They spent the rest of the night in that room, Damien painting, Elena reading in the corner, both of them comfortable in the shared silence, in the parallel peace of two people creating their own experiences side by side, without needing constant interaction or validation. It felt domestic, felt real, felt like a preview of what their life together could be if they were brave enough to build it. Over the following weeks, Damien and Elena fell into new rhythms together. She still came Tuesday and Friday mornings, but now she stayed after the cleaning was done, and Damien worked from home those days, setting up his laptop on the kitchen counter while she moved through the space, both of them comfortable in each other's presence, both of them learning how to share space without constantly performing or entertaining. Wednesday became their day for adventures, for exploring the city together, for Elena showing Damien her New York, the immigrant New York, the neighborhood New York that existed beneath the Manhattan he knew. They ate at tiny restaurants in Queens, where the menu wasn't in English and the food tasted like someone's grandmother's kitchen. They walked through street markets in the Bronx, where Elena greeted vendors in a dozen different languages. They rode the subway instead of his car service, crammed in with everyone else, and Damien learned what it felt like to be anonymous, to be just another person instead of someone people recognized and deferred to. Elena enrolled in a part-time graduate program in counseling psychology. Damien paid the tuition, and they'd had long conversations about it first, about boundaries and independence, and how to accept help without losing autonomy. They'd agreed that it was a loan, that Elena would pay it back eventually when she was established in her career, not because Damien needed the money, but because Elena needed to know she'd earned it, that her education was an investment in herself she'd chosen to make with his support instead of something given to her that made her feel obligated. It was a compromise that honored both of them, and Damien was learning that good relationships were built on exactly that, on finding ways to honor both people's needs instead of one person always sacrificing for the other. Damien started painting again, every morning before work, 2 hours in his studio with the door open now instead of locked, with music playing and light flooding in, and the smell of oil paint replacing the antiseptic emptiness that had defined his mornings for years. Elena would often sit with him, reading for her classes, occasionally looking up to watch him work, and her presence made the creation feel fuller somehow, made it feel like he was painting not just for himself, but for her, for them, for the life they were building together. He'd started a new series, large canvases exploring themes of isolation and connection, of what it meant to be seen, of the courage required to be vulnerable in a world that rewarded performance over authenticity. A gallery owner who was a casual acquaintance saw the work when she stopped by for a business meeting and immediately offered him a show. Damien had been terrified, had wanted to refuse, had felt all the old shame about being an artist rise up to remind him that serious people didn't paint, that success meant business, not creation. But Elena had encouraged him, had reminded him that he could be both, that he didn't have to choose, that the world needed his art as much as it needed his business acumen. The show opened on a cold November evening, and Damien was more nervous than he'd been for any business presentation or investor pitch. This felt more exposing, more vulnerable, like hanging his insides on gallery walls and inviting strangers to judge them. But Elena was there, wearing a dress the color of midnight that made her look like something from a dream, and she held his hand through the whole evening, grounded him, reminded him why he'd said yes to this terrifying possibility. The work sold. All of it. Critics praised his raw emotional honesty, his technical skill, his unique perspective as someone who'd succeeded in business, but hadn't lost his humanity in the process. But more than the sales or the reviews, Damien felt proud because he'd honored a part of himself he'd abandoned, because he'd proven that success didn't have to mean sacrificing the things that made him whole, because he'd shown up as his complete self instead of the edited version he thought the world required. After the opening, Damien and Elena walked back to the penthouse through the cold night, both of them quiet, both processing the significance of what had just happened. When they arrived, Damien poured wine, and they sat on the terrace they'd transformed into a garden, surrounded by the herbs and vegetables and flowers Elena had planted, now dormant for winter, but waiting beneath the soil for spring's return. "I'm proud of you," Elena said, raising her glass, "for being brave, for showing your work, for letting people see the real you." "I couldn't have done it without you," Damien said honestly. 6 months ago, I was living in an empty apartment, eating takeout alone every night, convinced that isolation was safety and success was enough. You changed everything. You showed me what I was missing. You taught me how to be human again." Elena shook her head. "I didn't teach you anything, Damien. I just reminded you of what you already knew but had forgotten. The capacity to connect, to create, to love. That was always in you. You just needed permission to access it again." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Damien said quietly, "I want you to move in with me. I know it's fast. I know we've only been together a few months. But you're already here most of the time anyway. And I want it to be official. I want this to be our home, not my home that you visit. I want to wake up with you every morning and fall asleep with you every night, and build a life together in this space that used to feel like a prison, but now feels like possibility." Elena set down her wine glass and looked at him seriously. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Moving in together is a big step, Damien. It changes everything. It means you'll see me at my worst, grumpy in the mornings, stressed about school, messy when I'm tired. It means sharing space and making compromises and dealing with each other's annoying habits. It means being real with each other every single day, not just on our best behavior." "I want that," Damien said. "All of it. The grumpy mornings and the stress and the mess. I want the real you, Elena, not the performed version. I've spent my whole life performing, pretending, showing people what they wanted to see instead of who I actually was. I'm done with that. I want authentic and messy and real. I want us." Elena smiled, and there were tears in her eyes. "Then yes," she said. "Yes, I'll move in with you. Yes, I want to build a life here together. Yes to all of it." They sealed the agreement with a kiss, and then they went inside and made love in Damien's bed, their bed now, and it was tender and passionate and real. And afterward, they lay tangled together, skin against skin, heartbeat against heartbeat, and Damien thought about how far he'd come from that lonely man who'd hired someone to clean his apartment, and found instead someone who'd cleaned the cobwebs from his heart. Elena moved in the following week, bringing boxes of books and clothes and small treasures from Romania, photographs of her grandmother and dried flowers and handwritten recipes, and all the small, beautiful pieces that made up a life. The penthouse transformed, became cluttered in the best way, became lived in and warm and real. There were Elena's shoes by the door, and her coat on the rack, and her coffee mug in the sink, and her presence in every room, making everything better, making everything more. Damien's sister came to visit for Thanksgiving, 4 months sober and fragile but trying, and she met Elena and immediately understood what Damien had found, saw how Elena had helped him become someone capable of reaching out again, someone capable of repair instead of abandonment. The three of them cooked together in the kitchen, made a chaotic, messy meal that was more about connection than cuisine, and Damien felt his family start to heal, felt the possibility of rebuild instead of ruin. Sarah stayed in the guest room for a week, and every night they talked, really talked, about their childhood and their pain and their separate paths toward healing. She told him about her sponsor, about the steps, about learning to forgive herself for all the years she'd lost to addiction. He told her about Elena, about art, about discovering that success without connection was just expensive loneliness. On Sarah's last night there, the three of them sat on the terrace wrapped in blankets against the December cold, and Sarah said quietly, "I never thought I'd see you like this. Happy, open, human. I always thought you were so strong, so together, so far above all the mess the rest of us were drowning in. But you were just better at hiding, weren't you? Better at pretending you didn't hurt." Damien nodded. "I thought strength meant not needing anyone. I thought success meant being self-sufficient. I thought admitting pain was weakness. Elena taught me that was all bullshit, that real strength is vulnerability, that success means building something meaningful, not just profitable, that admitting pain is the first step toward healing." Sarah looked at Elena. "Thank you," she said simply, "for seeing him, for staying, for showing him he was worth more than his bank account." Elena reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand. "We all deserve to be seen," she said gently. "We all deserve someone who stays. We all deserve healing." "You're doing the work, Sarah. That takes courage. Don't forget that." Winter deepened, and the city transformed into something crystalline and beautiful, and Damien experienced New York in a way he never had before. He'd always rushed through seasons, barely noticing them, too focused on quarterly earnings and market trends, and the next deal to pay attention to something as simple as weather. But Elena slowed him down, made him notice things. She dragged him to the skating rink at Rockefeller Center, even though neither of them could skate well, and they laughed and fell and held on to each other for balance and looked ridiculous and didn't care. They walked through Central Park after snowstorms, through that particular silence that comes when fresh snow muffles the city's constant noise, and Elena taught him how to notice beauty in small things: ice crystals on branches, cardinal footprints in white powder, the way light changed when filtered through winter clouds. Elena's first semester was demanding, and Damien learned how to support someone pursuing their dreams. Learned that love meant making space for the other person's growth, even when it was inconvenient, even when it meant quiet dinners because she was exhausted from studying, even when it meant her being distracted and preoccupied because her mind was full of theories and case studies and the weight of other people's trauma she was learning to hold. He learned to ask how he could help instead of assuming what she needed. Learned that sometimes help meant making dinner, and sometimes it meant leaving her alone, and sometimes it meant just sitting with her while she processed her day. He was learning that relationships required attention and adjustment, that loving someone meant constantly recalibrating, constantly checking in, constantly choosing them over and over, instead of assuming one choice at the beginning would be enough forever. Damien's company continued to thrive, but he'd started making changes there too. Started thinking about legacy instead of just profit, about impact instead of just growth. He'd established a foundation focused on arts education in underserved communities, remembering how painting had saved him, how creation had given him a way to process pain when he had no other tools. He'd started mentoring young entrepreneurs, especially those from difficult backgrounds, sharing not just business strategy but honest conversations about the cost of success, about the importance of maintaining humanity while building empires, about the danger of sacrificing everything for achievement and discovering too late that achievement without connection was just decorated emptiness. Elena started a support group for immigrant women, meeting weekly in a community center in Queens, offering a space for women to share their experiences, their struggles, their small victories. She invited Damien to come observe one evening, and he sat quietly in the back and watched her facilitate, watched her hold space for other people's pain, watched her validate and encourage, and gently challenge, and he fell even more in love with her capacity to see people, to make them feel worthy of care, to help them believe in their own strength. After the session, several women came up to thank her, and Damien saw the same thing in their eyes that he felt when he looked at Elena. That gratitude for being seen, that relief at being accepted, that hope that maybe healing was possible after all. On Christmas Eve, Damien took Elena to meet his grandmother's grave. It was a small cemetery in Ohio, and they drove there through snow and cold, and Damien hadn't been back since the funeral 8 years ago because it hurt too much, because visiting meant admitting she was really gone, because he hadn't known how to grieve without breaking completely, so he'd just avoided it instead. But Elena held his hand as they walked to the headstone, and Damien knelt in the snow and told his grandmother about Elena, about painting again, about reconciling with Sarah, about learning to be whole instead of successful. He cried, and Elena cried with him, and it was sad, but it was also healing, was also a kind of closure, was also permission to carry his grandmother's love forward, instead of locking it away with all the other things he deemed too painful to touch. They spent Christmas with Sarah in Portland, in her tiny apartment that smelled like coffee and hope, and it was nothing like the Christmases of Damien's wealthy adulthood. No catered dinners, or expensive gifts, or careful performance. They ate take-out Chinese food, and watched bad movies, and played board games. And it was ordinary and real, and exactly what family was supposed to be. People who saw each other clearly, and chose to show up anyway. People who'd hurt each other, and were learning to forgive. People who were all works in progress, and could admit it without shame. Sarah gave Damien a painting she'd made in her art therapy class, rough and imperfect but deeply felt, a landscape of mountains and light, and Damien hung it in his studio next to his own work because it mattered more than technical perfection, because it was proof of her healing, because it was a bridge between who they'd been and who they were becoming. In January, Elena's mother and brothers came to visit from Romania, and Damien's penthouse filled with Romanian language and laughter and the smell of traditional cooking, and he met the family Elena had been supporting all these years, saw where her strength came from, understood better the weight she'd carried in choosing to leave them, in sending money home, in building a life here while missing them constantly. Elena's mother hugged Damien tight and said in careful English that she could tell he was good for her daughter, that he looked at Elena the way her husband had looked at her, like she was both the adventure and the home, and Damien felt accepted into something larger than just his relationship with Elena, felt welcomed into a family in a way he'd never experienced growing up. They took Elena's family to all the places Damien had discovered. With her, the small restaurants and street markets and hidden corners of the city that tourists never saw. And Damien realized he was now showing others the New York Elena had given him, was passing forward the gift of seeing differently, of noticing beauty in unexpected places, of valuing experience over luxury. Elena's youngest brother, just 19, was studying engineering, and Damien spent hours talking with him about his dreams, about wanting to build sustainable infrastructure, about hoping to return to Romania someday and help modernize the villages that were slowly dying as young people left for cities. Damien connected him with colleagues, offered to support his education if he wanted to study in the States, and saw Elena's eyes fill with tears at his generosity, at his willingness to invest in her family, not as charity, but as genuine care. On Valentine's Day, Damien planned something special. He'd been working secretly with a jewelry designer for weeks, creating something unique, something that captured who they were together instead of just defaulting to traditional expectations. He took Elena to the gallery where he'd had his show, which was now hosting a small exhibition of his new work, paintings he'd created over the past months, all of them exploring themes of connection and healing and the courage required to be vulnerable. Elena walked through the show with tears streaming down her face, seeing their story told in color and light, seeing how Damien had translated what she'd given him into art that other people could feel and connect with and maybe find their own healing through. At the center of the exhibition was the largest painting, the one he'd been working on for months, keeping hidden from her. It showed two figures, abstract but recognizable, standing together in a garden suspended impossibly in the sky, surrounded by flowers and light, roots growing down into clouds, everything defying gravity and logic, but somehow feeling absolutely real. "It's us," Elena whispered, and Damien came to stand beside her. "It's us learning to grow in places that seemed impossible," he said quietly. "It's us building something beautiful in thin air. It's us choosing each other every day, even though everything about how we met and who we are suggests this shouldn't work, suggests we're too different, suggests the cleaner and the billionaire is a fairy tale that can't survive reality. But it does work, and it's not a fairy tale. It's just real people choosing to be real with each other." Elena turned to him, and he got down on one knee right there in the gallery, in front of the painting that was their story, and he pulled out the ring he'd designed, a band of intertwined metals, gold and silver, different, but merged together, inseparable. "Elena," he said, and his voice was shaken but clear, "you found me when I was lost. You saw me when I was invisible. You loved me when I was convinced I was unlovable. You taught me that hiding isn't safety, that success isn't enough, that the scary, vulnerable, real things are the ones most worth doing. I want to spend the rest of my life growing with you, creating with you, building something beautiful in impossible places with you. Will you marry me?" Elena was crying too hard to speak, so she just nodded frantically, and Damien slid the ring onto her finger and stood and pulled her into his arms, and the gallery erupted in applause because there were other people there, patrons and friends and strangers who'd come to see his work, and they'd all just witnessed something real and raw and beautiful. They were married 6 months later in the penthouse garden Elena had created, surrounded by the herbs and vegetables and flowers that had survived winter and returned stronger, surrounded by family both blood and chosen, surrounded by beauty they'd built together from what had been empty space. Sarah was there, 1 year sober and glowing with health and hope. Elena's family flew in from Romania, her mother crying happy tears through the entire ceremony. Damien's colleagues from the business world mixed with Elena's classmates and the women from her support group, and the combination felt right, felt whole, felt like a life that honored all the parts of who they both were instead of forcing them to choose which parts were acceptable. The ceremony was simple and real, officiated by Elena's faculty advisor, who'd become a friend and mentor. And when it came time for vows, Damien spoke from his heart. "Elena, I was 42 floors above the world when you found me, but I was living in a basement of my own making, trapped in darkness I'd built from my own fear and shame and conviction that I was too broken to be loved completely. You brought light, not by trying to fix me or change me or save me, but by seeing me, all of me, the successful parts and the broken parts and the scared parts, and choosing to stay anyway. You taught me that I wasn't too much or too little. I was exactly right. I just needed to find someone whose heart was vast enough to embrace the whole truth of who I am. You are that person. You are my home, my garden, my light, my reminder every single day that the scary things are worth doing, that vulnerability is strength, that love requires courage, but the courage is always worth it." Elena's vows were equally simple and devastating. "Damien, when I walked into your penthouse that first morning, I saw a man who'd built everything except a life, who'd achieved everything except happiness, who'd protected himself so thoroughly that he'd forgotten what he was protecting. I left you daisies because flowers are brave. They bloom anyway. They insist on beauty and color, and life even in the smallest spaces. And I saw that same bravery in you, buried deep but still alive, still waiting for permission to grow. You gave me so much more than I gave you. You believed in my dreams when I'd stopped believing in them myself. You welcomed my family as your own. You showed me that success without sacrifice is possible, that I can build a career and maintain connection, that I don't have to choose between ambition and love. You taught me I can be big, can take up space, can demand to be seen and valued and honored. Together, we're building something bigger than both of us, something that grows and blooms and insists on beauty even in impossible places. They exchanged rings, the ones Damien had designed, intertwined metals that could never be separated. And when the officiant pronounced them married, they kissed, and everyone cheered, and Damien felt complete in a way he'd never imagined possible. The reception was held on the terrace, catered by the Italian grandmother's restaurant in Brooklyn, with music and dancing and laughter and joy. Damien danced with Elena under string lights, while their garden bloomed around them, while their families mingled and connected, while their separate worlds merged into something new and beautiful and theirs. Sarah gave a toast, her voice strong and clear, thanking Elena for giving her back her brother, for teaching him how to love, for making space in his life for the messy, imperfect people who needed him. Elena's mother gave a toast in Romanian that her oldest brother translated, blessing the marriage, welcoming Damien into their family, expressing gratitude that her daughter had found someone who saw her value, who honored her strength, who built her up instead of diminishing her. The party lasted late into the night, and when it finally ended and everyone had left, and it was just the two of them, Damien and Elena stood on their terrace looking out over the city, over the life they'd built together from empty spaces and lonely hearts, and the courage to try something scary. "This is just the beginning," Elena said softly, leaning into him. "I know," Damien replied, wrapping his arms around her, "and I can't wait to see what we grow next." They honeymooned in Romania, and Elena showed Damien the village where she grew up, the mountains she'd climbed as a child, her grandmother's house that was still standing, weathered but sturdy, holding memories in every stone. They visited her grandmother's grave, and Damien left flowers, thanking this woman he'd never met for raising the person who'd saved him, for teaching Elena about kindness and courage, and the importance of seeing people clearly. They hiked through forests and swam in cold mountain streams and ate meals prepared by villagers who remembered Elena as a little girl and marveled at the life she'd built in America, at the good man she'd found, at the way they looked at each other like they were each other's favorite discovery. When they returned to New York, to the penthouse that was now fully theirs, filled with both their histories and all their shared memories, they settled into married life with surprising ease. They'd already been living together, already knew each other's rhythms and habits and quirks. But marriage felt different somehow, felt more committed, felt like permission to plan futures and make big decisions and build something that would outlast both of them. Elena finished her second year of grad school with honors. Her thesis focused on therapeutic approaches for immigrant trauma, earning praise from her faculty and interest from several community clinics. Damien's art career continued to flourish alongside his business, and he found balance between the two, discovered that creation and commerce didn't have to be enemies, that he could succeed in both if he stayed true to himself in each. They started talking about children, about whether they wanted them, what kind of parents they'd be, how they'd protect their kids from the mistakes their own parents had made, while still preparing them for a world that was beautiful and broken in equal measure. They weren't ready yet. Both agreed on that. But they wanted to be someday, wanted to fill their home with more life, more laughter, more love. Sarah moved to New York, 2 years sober and ready for a fresh start. And Damien helped her get an apartment in Brooklyn, helped her find a job at a gallery where her rough artistic talent was valued, helped her build a life that was hers instead of defined by her addiction. She and Elena became close, sisters by choice instead of marriage, and Damien watched them together and felt grateful that the two most important women in his life loved each other, supported each other, made each other laugh. The Penthouse continued to transform. The studio was always full of work in progress, both Damien's paintings and increasingly Elena's photography, a hobby she'd picked up that was becoming something more serious, her images of immigrants and displaced people earning recognition and beginning to sell. The terrace garden expanded every season, Elena constantly adding new plants, new varieties, transforming the space into something lush and wild and alive. The living room accumulated more books and art and photographs, the careful minimalism Damien had once maintained, giving way to the beautiful clutter of a life actually lived. They hosted dinner parties, filled their home with friends and family and colleagues, created community instead of isolation, chose connection over perfection every single time. 3 years after they married, Elena opened her own practice, a small clinic in Queens, focused on serving immigrant communities, offering therapy on a sliding scale, creating exactly the kind of space she'd dreamed about back when she was cleaning apartments and saving every dollar. Damien helped fund the startup costs, helped her navigate business licenses and insurance, and all the practical details of running a clinic. But the vision was entirely hers, and watching her build it, watching her step into her full power and purpose, was one of the greatest joys of his life. Her practice thrived. Word spread in immigrant communities that here was someone who understood, someone who'd walked the same difficult path, someone who could hold their pain without judgment and help them find their way toward healing. Elena hired 2 other therapists, both immigrants themselves, and created jobs while creating healing, building something that mattered in ways that couldn't be measured in profit margins or market share, but that changed lives in deep and lasting ways. Damien's foundation grew too, funding arts programs in hundreds of schools, providing supplies and instruction. And most importantly, the message that creativity mattered, that making beautiful things was as valuable as making profitable things, that the world needed artists and dreamers and people brave enough to insist on beauty even in difficult circumstances. He started teaching occasional workshops, going into schools himself, and working with kids who reminded him of himself, kids from hard backgrounds who needed someone to believe in them, to tell them that their circumstances didn't define their potential, that they could build something different if they were willing to work and dream and not give up on themselves. On their 5th wedding anniversary, they threw a party in their garden, inviting everyone who'd been part of their journey, everyone who'd witnessed their transformation from lonely, isolated individuals into a couple who'd built something beautiful together. The garden was spectacular. 5 years of growth resulting in a terrace that felt like a secret oasis suspended in the sky, full of vegetables and herbs and flowers, fruit trees in containers, vines climbing trellises, butterflies and bees, life insisting on itself even 42 floors above concrete and steel. Sarah brought her girlfriend, a kind woman who worked in addiction recovery and understood the daily work of staying whole. Elena's family came again, her youngest brother, now studying at Columbia on scholarship, his engineering dreams becoming reality with Damien's mentorship and support. As the party wound down and guests began leaving, Damien and Elena found themselves alone on the terrace, the same terrace where he'd proposed, where they'd married, where they'd spent countless evenings talking and planning and dreaming together. Elena had something in her hand, a small wrapped package, and she gave it to Damien with a nervous smile. "I know we said no gifts," she said, "but this one couldn't wait." Damien opened it carefully, and inside was a book, leather-bound and handmade. And when he opened it, he found photographs, hundreds of them, pictures of their journey together, starting with a candid shot of Damien painting that Elena had taken secretly in those early months, progressing through their dating and engagement and wedding and married life, a visual chronicle of their transformation, of how they'd changed each other, of how they'd grown. But tucked into the back of the book was something else, a photograph, an ultrasound image, and it took Damien a moment to understand what he was seeing, and when he did, his hand started shaking and his eyes filled with tears, and he looked up at Elena in wonder. "We're having a baby," she said, and she was crying too, happy tears, scared tears, excited tears, all mixed together. "I'm 10 weeks along. I wanted to tell you in a way that honored our story, that reminded you how far we've come, how much we've built together, because we're about to build something even bigger. And I wanted you to remember that we can do this, that we can grow our family the same way we grew our garden, with patience and care and love." Damien couldn't speak. He just pulled Elena into his arms and held her tight. This woman who'd changed everything, who'd saved him without trying to save him, who'd just given him the most precious news he'd ever received. They were going to be parents. They were going to raise a child together. Were going to pass forward everything they'd learned about love and healing and courage and connection. It was terrifying and perfect and exactly right. "I love you," Damien finally managed. "I love you so much. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for staying. Thank you for building this life with me. Thank you for this gift." "I love you too," Elena whispered. "Thank you for being brave enough to let me in. Thank you for growing with me. Thank you for showing me that we can be big together, that we can take up space, that we can insist on beauty and love and life even when the world suggests it's impossible." The baby arrived 7 months later, a daughter they named Hope, because that was what Elena had brought into Damien's life, what they wanted to give to the world, what they wanted their daughter to carry forward. Hope was tiny and perfect and utterly terrifying, and Damien held her for the first time and felt a love so vast it seemed impossible that his body could contain it. Felt every protective instinct he'd buried come roaring back to life. Felt his heart expand to make room for this new person who'd need him in ways no one ever had. Elena watched him with their daughter and knew she'd chosen right. Knew this man would be an extraordinary father. Knew he'd break cycles instead of repeating them. Knew he'd give Hope everything he'd never had, security and presence and unconditional love. They navigated new parenthood together, exhausted and overwhelmed, and completely in love with their tiny daughter, who'd reorganized their entire world around her needs and wants and rhythms. The penthouse filled with baby things, the careful aesthetic giving way entirely to the beautiful chaos of a home with an infant, bottles and diapers and toys, and the constant background noise of a little person making her presence known. Damien cut back his work hours, wanting to be present, wanting to be the father he'd never had, wanting Hope to grow up knowing she was valued and seen and prioritized. Elena took time off from her practice, knowing she'd return eventually, but wanting these early months to bond and nurse and rest and recover and fall completely in love with being a mother. Sarah visited often, falling in love with her niece, marveling at how Damien had become this gentle, patient father, how he could be so commanding in business, but so tender with his daughter, how he'd learned to be both strong and soft, successful and present, powerful and vulnerable. She'd started painting seriously, was working toward her own show, and watching her brother's journey had given her courage to pursue her own dreams, to believe that healing was possible, that you could overcome your past instead of being defined by it, that family could be rebuilt instead of abandoned as broken. Elena's practice reopened after 4 months, and she worked part-time, balancing career and motherhood, discovering that she could be both therapist and mother, that the skills translated, that caring for her own child made her better for it caring for other people's pain, gave her deeper understanding of what it meant to nurture and protect and help someone grow. Damien's art continued to evolve, his new paintings incorporating themes of fatherhood, of watching hope grow, of the terrifying, beautiful responsibility of shaping a human being, of trying to give her everything he'd never had while not smothering her with his own need to protect her from every difficulty. The gallery was planning another show, and Damien was both excited and nervous, wondering how audiences would respond to work that was so personal, so vulnerable, so different from the corporate success story they expected from him. But he'd learned that the scary things were worth doing, that vulnerability was strength, that showing up as his whole self was always better than performing a version he thought people wanted. Hope grew from newborn to infant to toddler, constantly changing, constantly teaching them new things about patience and flexibility and unconditional love. She had Elena's eyes and Damien's determination and her own fierce personality that suggested she'd grow up knowing exactly who she was and refusing to apologize for it. They took her to Romania when she was 18 months old, introduced her to Elena's family, to the mountains and forests and village that had shaped her mother, and hope ran through her great-grandmother's garden with pure joy, fearless and free, and Elena cried, watching her daughter claim this heritage, this history, this part of herself. On Hope's 2nd birthday, they threw a party in the garden that had become legendary in their circle, the impossible terrace that defied gravity and logic and produced vegetables and flowers 42 floors in the air. Children ran through the space, playing and laughing and making the kind of joyful noise that used to terrify Damien, but now just made him smile. Sarah was there with her girlfriend, who'd recently proposed. Elena's brothers came, the youngest now graduated and working on sustainable infrastructure projects in Eastern Europe. Colleagues from both Damien's business world and Elena's therapeutic practice mingled easily, and Damien looked around at the life they'd built, at the community they'd created, at the love they'd multiplied instead of hoarding, and felt grateful in a way that was almost painful in its intensity. That evening, after everyone had left and Hope was asleep, Damien and Elena sat on their terrace like they had so many times before. But now there was a baby monitor between them, a reminder that they weren't just two anymore. They were three. They were a family. "Do you remember," Damien said quietly, "the first day you came to clean my apartment? How empty everything was. How careful and cold and lifeless." Elena smiled. "I remember thinking you were the saddest person I'd ever encountered," she said. "All that success, all that money, all that achievement, and you were completely alone and had convinced yourself that was strength instead of tragedy." "I almost didn't come back," Damien admitted. "When I saw that first Daisy, I almost called the agency to complain, to demand they send someone who would just do the job without adding anything personal." "I'm so glad you didn't," Elena said. "I'm so glad you were brave enough to let me see you, to accept my small gestures, to open those locked doors and show me your art and your pain and your secret hope, that maybe you could be more than just successful." "I was terrified," Damien said, "every step of the way. Terrified to let you in, terrified to paint again, terrified to reconcile with Sarah, terrified to love you completely, terrified to become a father. Every significant thing we've done together has scared me absolutely senseless. And yet you did them anyway," Elena said. "That's courage, Damien. Courage isn't not being afraid. It's being afraid and choosing to move forward anyway, choosing connection over safety, choosing vulnerability over protection, choosing to grow even when growth is painful and uncertain. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Damien spoke again. "I want to tell you something I've never said out loud," he said. "Sometimes I still wake up and can't believe this is my life. Can't believe you chose me. Can't believe I have a daughter sleeping in the next room. Can't believe I get to wake up next to you every morning and paint in my studio and run my company and be part of a family and have friends and community and all of this when 5 years ago I had none of it, when I'd convinced myself I didn't need any of it, that success was enough." Elena took his hand. "You know what I can't believe," she said. "I can't believe that scared, lonely man I met is the same person sitting here now. You've done so much work, Damien. You've changed so much. You've opened yourself up in ways that must have felt impossible. You've learned to need people, to ask for help, to show weakness, to prioritize relationships over achievement. You've become exactly the kind of father and husband and friend and artist and businessman you always had the capacity to be, but were too scared to attempt. I'm proud of you. So incredibly proud." They kissed softly. 5 years of history in that kiss. 5 years of choosing each other every single day. 5 years of building something that kept getting bigger and stronger and more beautiful. The following morning, Damien woke early and went to his studio as was his routine. But this time he brought Hope with him, carrying her still sleepy against his chest, showing her the paintings he'd been working on, telling her stories about what they meant even though she was too young to understand the words. She touched the wet paint on his current piece, leaving a small handprint, and Damien laughed and decided to keep it there, to incorporate her mark into his work, because that's what family meant. Everyone leaving their mark on each other, everyone being changed by everyone else, the boundaries between where one person ended and another began becoming beautifully blurred. Elena found them there an hour later, father and daughter covered in paint, both laughing, both completely content. And she took a photograph because this was the life she wanted to remember. Not just the big moments, but the small ones. Not just the achievements, but the ordinary mornings. Not just the beginnings and endings, but all the beautiful middle parts where actual life happened. She posted the photo to social media with a simple caption, "5 years ago, I was hired to clean his penthouse. What I found changed everything." The post went viral, their story resonating with millions of people who saw in it their own hope for transformation, their own possibility of healing, their own belief that maybe it wasn't too late to choose differently, to open up, to let someone in. Media outlets wanted interviews, wanted to tell their story, wanted to package their relationship into easy lessons and motivational content. Damien and Elena discussed it, talked about privacy and what they owed the world versus what they owed themselves and their daughter, and decided to do one interview, one chance to tell their story their way, to clarify that it wasn't a fairy tale, wasn't as simple as rich man meets poor woman and money solves everything, but was actually the much harder story of two people choosing to do the difficult work of healing and growing and changing together. The interview ran in a major magazine, accompanied by photographs of them in their garden, in Damien's studio, at Elena's clinic, showing the full scope of their life together, not just the romance, but the work, the purpose, the community they'd built. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of messages from people sharing their own stories of isolation and healing, from people who'd been living behind walls and were considering taking them down, from people who'd prioritized achievement over connection and were starting to question whether that was sustainable, from people who needed permission to believe that change was possible, that it was never too late, that the scary things were worth doing. Damien and Elena read the messages together, humbled by the impact their story had, grateful they'd chosen to share it, hoping it made some small difference in helping others believe in their own capacity for transformation. 5 years became 10, and the garden grew larger. The art collection grew deeper. Hope was joined by a son they named Gabriel, after Elena's grandfather, and their family expanded in size and love and chaos. Damien's hair went fully silver at the temples, distinguished now instead of just aging, and Elena got tiny laugh lines around her eyes from a decade of smiling more than she'd ever imagined possible. Sarah got married, 4 years sober and thriving, working as an art therapist and paying forward the healing she'd received. Elena's practice became a network of clinics serving immigrant communities across the city, and she trained other therapists, expanded her impact, became a leader in trauma-informed care for displaced populations. Damien's company continued to innovate and grow, but he'd restructured it to prioritize sustainability and social impact over pure profit, had shifted the focus from maximum shareholder value to stakeholder value, considering employees and communities and environment alongside financial returns. It was still successful, still profitable, but now it was also purposeful. Now it aligned with his values instead of contradicting them. His art had become well known, his pieces in museums and private collections worldwide. But he still painted every morning, not for sales or recognition, but because creation was how he processed his life, how he made sense of his journey, how he honored the gift Elena had given him when she'd encouraged him to unlock that door and reclaim that part of himself. They took a family vacation to Ohio, showing their children where Damien grew up, visiting his grandmother's grave with Hope and Gabriel, telling them stories about the woman who'd believed in him when no one else did, who'd taught him that love didn't have to be conditional, that goodness existed even in difficult circumstances. The kids put flowers on her headstone, and Damien cried. But this time, it wasn't just sadness. It was also gratitude, was also pride that he'd honored her memory by building a life she'd be proud of, by being the kind of man she'd always believed he could be, by raising children in the warmth and security and love she'd shown him was possible. On their 10th anniversary, Damien and Elena returned to the Italian restaurant in Brooklyn, where they'd had their first real date. And it was exactly the same, still warm and loud and full of life. The grandmother still in the kitchen, still coming out to hug Elena and pinch Damien's cheeks and demand to see photos of the children. They ate the same pasta, drank the same wine, sat at the same table. But everything else was different because they were different, had grown and changed and deepened, had accumulated a decade of history together, had weathered challenges and celebrated victories, and built something that kept getting stronger instead of weaker. "What's the most important thing you've learned?" Elena asked over dessert. "About us, about life, about what makes this work," Damien thought carefully, wanting to give her a real answer instead of a romantic platitude. "I think," he said slowly, "the most important thing I've learned is that love is a practice, not a feeling. Feelings come and go. They're wonderful but unreliable. But practice is daily, is choosing, is showing up even when it's hard, even when you're tired, even when the feeling isn't overwhelming in the moment. I practice loving you every day. I practice being a good father every day. I practice being creative, being honest, being present, being vulnerable, being brave. And the practice matters more than any single moment of feeling." Elena smiled, that smile he'd been falling in love with for a decade. "I've learned that being seen is the greatest gift you can give someone," she said. "Really seen. Not the performed version, but the real version. The messy, complicated, contradictory version. When you see someone fully and choose to stay, choose to love, choose to honor all of who they are, you give them permission to be whole instead of fractured. That's what you gave me, Damien. Permission to be big, to take up space, to believe my dreams mattered as much as anyone else's. And that's what I hope we give our children. Permission to be exactly who they are without apology or diminishment. They walked home through Brooklyn, through streets they'd walked 1,000 times. But it never got old, because the city was always changing. And they were always changing, and paying attention meant noticing the changes instead of taking anything for granted. When they got home, the babysitter left, and they checked on their sleeping children, Hope, now 7, and Gabriel, 4, both beautiful and wild and entirely themselves, both evidence that love multiplied instead of divided, that you could keep expanding your capacity for care without ever running empty. Later that night, lying in bed together, bodies intertwined in the familiar, comfortable way of long-married couples, Damien said quietly, "I've been thinking about the penthouse, about whether we want to stay here or look for something different as the kids get older." Elena propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I don't know exactly," Damien admitted. "Part of me loves this place because it's where our story happened, where we transformed it together from that empty, cold space into an actual home. But part of me wonders if the kids would benefit from having a yard, a neighborhood with other children, a different kind of life than being 42 floors up." "We could get a house," Elena said thoughtfully. "Fornont, Brooklyn maybe, or one of the other boroughs. Somewhere with space for a real garden, for the kids to run around, for us to keep building and growing. But also," she added, "we could keep this place. Use it as a studio, as a retreat, as a connection to our history. You don't have to choose one or the other, Damien. You can be both the man who lives in a penthouse and the man who has a home with a yard. You can honor where you've been while building where you're going." "You're right," Damien said, pulling her close. "You're always right about these things, about finding ways to hold multiple truths instead of forcing false choices. It's one of the many things I love about you, this capacity to see possibilities where I only see either or." They started looking at houses the following month, bringing the kids along, exploring neighborhoods, imagining different versions of their future. They found a brownstone in Park Slope, a beautiful old building with high ceilings and original details, and a backyard that was small but perfect, with mature trees and enough space for a substantial garden and room for the children to play. It needed work, needed updating, and renovation. But Damien and Elena could see its potential, could imagine what it might become with attention and care and love, the same way they'd imagined what their relationship might become when they were just beginning. They bought the house but kept the penthouse, transforming it into exactly what Elena had suggested, a studio space for both of them, Damien's painting corner and Elena's photography corner, and a meditation room and guest rooms for when family visited. The brownstone became their primary home, and slowly they transformed it together, making decisions about paint colors and furniture and how to allocate space, making it theirs the same way they'd made the penthouse theirs. The backyard became Elena's domain, and she created something extraordinary, a garden that fed them and beautified the neighborhood and became a gathering place for community, for the children's birthday parties and neighborhood barbecues and quiet family dinners under string lights. Hope started school, came home full of stories and questions and fierce opinions, and Damien discovered a new kind of love, the love of watching your child become her own person, separate from you, but shaped by you, carrying forward your values, but interpreting them through her own unique lens. Gabriel followed 2 years later, quieter than his sister, but equally determined, equally certain of his place in the world, equally loved and secure. Damien and Elena navigated the chaos of school schedules and activities and homework and friendship dramas and all the beautiful ordinary challenges of raising children, and Damien thought often about how different this was from his own childhood, how he was breaking cycles, how he was giving his children what he'd never had: stability and presence and unconditional love. Sarah had children, 2 twin girls who were close in age to Gabriel, and the cousins grew up together, spent weekends and holidays together, formed the kind of deep sibling-like bonds that would last their whole lives. Damien watched Sarah with her daughters, saw how far she'd come, how thoroughly she'd healed, how she was giving her children the childhood neither of them had gotten, and felt grateful that they'd both found their way to this, that they'd both done the work of healing instead of just perpetuating pain. Elena's practice continued to expand, and she published papers and gave talks and became recognized internationally for her work with immigrant trauma. But she never lost sight of why she'd started, never became so focused on success that she forgot the human beings behind the theories and research. She still ran the support group in Queens, still made time for individual clients, still showed up every week to sit with other people's pain and help them find their way toward healing. Damien served on boards of arts organizations and education nonprofits, using his business expertise and resources to support causes he believed in, to create opportunities for young people from difficult backgrounds, to ensure that the ladder he'd climbed was available to others, not pulled up behind him. He mentored dozens of young entrepreneurs and artists, gave them honest advice about the costs and benefits of different paths, encouraged them to define success for themselves instead of accepting someone else's definition. He painted every day, still found it essential to his well-being, still needed that creative outlet to process his life and emotions, and his work continued to evolve, continued to explore deeper themes, continued to touch people who saw their own struggles reflected in his honest, vulnerable art. 15 years after that first morning when Elena walked into his penthouse to clean it, Damien woke early in their brownstone, in the bed he shared with his wife, in the house full of their children and their life together. He got up quietly, careful not to wake Elena, and went downstairs to make coffee. The house was peaceful in the early morning, still and quiet, holding the accumulated energy of 15 years of love and growth and family. He walked out to the garden, to the space Elena had created, and sat on the bench they'd installed, looking at everything they'd grown together, literally and figuratively. He thought about that man he'd been, isolated in his penthouse, convinced that success was enough, that he didn't need connection or creativity, or any of the soft, vulnerable things he'd spent his whole life running from. He thought about how close he'd come to never knowing this, to never experiencing the fullness of life that came from letting people in, from choosing vulnerability, from doing the scary things that led to the most beautiful outcomes. He thought about Elena, still asleep upstairs, this extraordinary woman who'd seen him when he was invisible, who'd loved him when he thought he was unlovable, who'd stayed through all his fear and resistance and slow, painful opening up, who'd built this life with him through patience and kindness and unwavering belief that he was worth the effort. The sun came up, golden light filling the garden, and Damien heard footsteps behind him. Elena sat down next to him on the bench, 2 mugs of coffee in her hands, and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching their garden come alive in the morning light, watching butterflies and bees begin their work, watching everything they'd planted continue to grow and flourish and produce beauty. "This is everything," Damien said quietly. "This garden, this house, our children sleeping upstairs, you beside me, the work we both do, the community we've built, the family we've healed and expanded, the art we create, the lives we touch. This is everything I never knew I needed, everything I was too scared to want, Everything that became possible because you saw me and stayed. Elena leaned her head on his shoulder. We saw each other, she said gently, and we both chose to stay. Both chose to grow. Both chose to be brave enough to build something real instead of settling for something safe. That's not just me, Damien. That's us. That's the life we created together, through 1,000 small choices to keep showing up, keep being honest, keep choosing connection over protection. They sat there as the morning deepened, as the city around them woke up, as their children began stirring upstairs, and Damien felt complete in a way that had nothing to do with achievement or success or any external measure of worth. He felt complete because he was whole, because he'd reclaimed all the parts of himself he'd abandoned, because he was living a life that honored his full humanity instead of just the parts that looked good on paper. Hope appeared in the doorway, sleepy and rumpled, Gabriel right behind her, and they climbed onto the bench between their parents, fitting themselves into the small spaces, making the family complete. "Good morning, my loves," Elena said, kissing each child's head. "Good morning," Damien echoed, wrapping his arms around all of them, holding his whole world, his whole heart, right here in this garden, in this moment, in this life they'd built together from empty spaces and lonely hearts, and the revolutionary choice to let love in. And as they sat there together, all four of them, watching the garden grow in the morning light, Damien understood finally what he'd been searching for his whole life, without knowing it. Not success, not achievement, not wealth or recognition or any of the things he'd spent decades pursuing. What he'd been searching for was this: connection and purpose and love and the daily practice of showing up as his whole self, the daily courage to be seen and to see others, the daily choice to grow something beautiful instead of protecting something empty. He'd been searching for permission to be human, to be flawed, to need people, to create art, to make mistakes, to try again, to believe he was worthy of love, not because of what he achieved, but because of who he was underneath all the achievement. And Elena had given him that permission, not through words, but through presence, not through fixing him, but through seeing him, not through changing him, but through accepting him and creating space for him to change himself. She'd shown him that the scary things were worth doing, that vulnerability was strength, that asking for help was courage, that needing people wasn't weakness, but the most human thing in the world. She'd taught him that love wasn't something you earned through perfection, but something you practiced through presence, through showing up, through choosing each other over and over, even when it was hard, even when you were tired, even when the feelings weren't overwhelming in the moment.